Today I have a beginner level video for MQL4 coding, and it's creating a relatively simple indicator, but it's one that you can use to expand further and add more features. So I'm kind of giving you a starter template indicator here. This is the MQL4 version of a video I released very recently for MQL5. It's exactly the same indicator, and I'm going to be creating exactly the same code but for the MQL4 version. If you've already seen the MQL5 version, then a lot of the code I'm about to show today will look the same. There are very few differences. If you haven't seen the MQL5 version, don't worry, I'm going to show everything in this video. I'm not going to be referring back to the earlier video. The indicator itself is relatively simple. I've got an upper line here and a lower line, and they are simply plotting the highs and lows of the price movement. And then inside those, I've created two additional lines, so I get a 3-channel type indicator. And the additional lines are measured a certain percentage above the low line or below the high line, or rather above the lower line and below the upper line. And there'll be inputs where you can set this distance above the lower line and the distance below the upper line. So let's get straight into the code for MQL4. So I have MetaTrader 4 open here. I'm going to open the editor now to create the indicator. I can open it either with this icon on the toolbar. If you don't have the toolbar, you can open it up by going to View and then Toolbars and turn it on. Or you can simply go to Tools and open the editor from MetaQuote's language editor, or just press F4. So now with the editor open, you can see that there are already folders for experts, files, include, indicators. And I've expanded the indicators folder already, and I've created this folder here called Orchard. I strongly recommend that for all of your custom indicators, you create your own folder. So I'm going to create one here under indicators, and you should create them under experts as well. And that's simply to avoid any conflict where you may install another indicator from a third party later. And if you drop everything straight into that indicators folder, or same for experts, then you run the risk of naming conflicts. But also, as you can see here, MetaQuotes tend to drop a lot of example files into this indicators folder in MetaTrader 4. So I just create a custom folder called Orchard, and I put all of my custom work inside those. So to begin by creating the indicator, I'm going to use the wizard to create the template. So I right click on the Orchard folder and New File. It knows that I'm already inside the indicators folder, so it's selected custom indicator by default there. I give my indicator a name. It's already filled in part of the path, indicators Orchard. I'm going to call it Triple Channel D. If this is the first time you've used the wizard, then author and link will be defaulting to MetaQuotes, but after you've completed, or after you've filled those in once, it will remember the values from the last time. This parameters, these will become inputs to the indicator, but I never use this part of the wizard. I always fill in the inputs directly in the code, so I'll just leave that. OnCalculate is the event that I'm going to be trapping to know when something happens on the chart. But I don't need OnTimer and OnChart events, so I can leave those unchecked. If I just check those, then it will create functions for these as well. This indicator you saw is on top of the candles, so that's the main chart window. It's not in a separate window like an RSI or a MACD, which would go below the main window. So I'm going to leave this indicator in separate window unchecked. And plots, you can fill in information here about the information that's going to be displayed on screen, but I'm going to do that directly in the code, so I'll also leave that blank. And now that has created this outline of the indicator. I don't like the way this looks. It's just clumsy. I don't like all of these comments with lots of boxes around them. So I'm just going to tidy this up a little bit. I won't change any of the code, just tidying up the appearance. So I've finished tidying up now. I changed this header comment. Just looks a little neater for me. Removed a lot of the extra stuff around here just to make it a nice clean window. Copyright, link, and version, they came from the wizard as we were filling it in. I'm going to add one more property here, that's property description. And I don't really have much to put in there, I'm just showing that you can use it. And this will appear when you first open up an indicator. In fact, you can have more than one of these descriptions and will show up on multiple lines, so I'm just going to add a second line just to show how that would be. And next, the wizard has already added this property strict. That is there because the language of MetaTrader 4, or the MQL4 language, evolved at one point. It used to be a very loose interpretation of the language and allowed a number of things which, while they were very flexible, also were prone to errors later, or made it easier to make coding errors. But because a lot of that code was already out there in the wild, this property strict was added rather than simply enforce new rules which could potentially break all of the code that was already there. You should always use property strict now. And then finally, this indicator chart window, we saw that in the wizard. This simply says that this chart or this indicator is going to be drawn on the main window with the candles. Next, I have to tell the indicator how many buffers I'm going to be using. So buffers will correspond to one of the things that are drawn on the screen. And this particular indicator had 4 lines, the upper, the lower, the high, and the low. So that's 4 buffers that I have. And then I'm going to put in some definitions about how each of those lines are drawn on the chart. These are also with property statements. The first one is the label, indicator underscore label, and you'll note there's a number 1 here. So this is the first of the lines that I'm defining. I'm just calling it upper. That's a label that you'll see on the data window. I'm setting the indicator color to yellow, the style to solid, the type, I'm drawing a line, and the width is 1. If you use a width greater than 1, then the style must be solid. So you'll note all of these, label, color, style, type, and width, they all have this number 1 after them, signifying that it's the first of these 4 buffers. Now I need to define the other 3. So here the second has all the same items, label, color, style, type, and now the number has changed to 2. So I'm calling this the high line. I'm coloring that green, and you see I've changed the style here to a dot. It's still a line though, and still width 1. And then I've done the same for low, which I'm making orange and a dot, and the lower line, which I'm making red and a solid line. And each time this number increments. So then I need some inputs. I begin each input statement with the input keyword. And if you look at some older code that you might find on the internet, this might be an extern keyword. Extern is a little different to input. There are a number of quite subtle differences in terms of where you can use those values with an extern keyword. But the main difference that most people would be concerned with is that with an input statement, the value of this variable is set at the input stage and can't be changed in the code later. So it protects you from accidentally changing that value. If you actually need to change the values, then I recommend you still capture these as an input, capture it into an INP variable, and then assign that to another variable later, and you can change that other variable as much as you like inside your code. But this is an input, it's an integer, int. My naming convention for inputs is always to begin with INP, capital I, INP, and then a word to describe whatever the input is for. That's followed by an equal sign and the default value for that input, and then the semicolon just ends that statement. At the end of this statement, I've got a comment, which would normally just be a comment inside the code and have nothing to do with anything else. But because this is an input statement, those comments are actually used as the prompt on the input screen. If you don't add these comments at the end of the input lines, then this variable name becomes the prompt on screen. And those variable names are often not user-friendly. So my first here is period, and that's going to be used to set how many bars I look at to find the high and the low values. The next input is a double, so it's a floating point number, and this is the upper percent, which I'm defaulting as 30, and that tells me how far the high line is below the upper line. So upper band percent, and that 30% is 30% of the distance between the upper line and the lower line. And it's also important, this, in my case, as I'm writing this indicator, that's 30% downwards from the upper line, not 30% upwards from the bottom line. Then the next is input double, and this is INP lower percent, which, as you might imagine, is keeping it symmetrical. This is also a default of 30. It's the lower band percent. The lower band is measured upwards from the lower line. Next, I need a place where I can store the values that are on each of those lines. So each line's drawn on the chart. They're drawn at a certain price. Those prices have to be stored somewhere. And you store those in buffers. The buffers are of type double. They are arrays, and they are arrays that are not dimensioned. And that's because the indicator will automatically resize those arrays to match the number of candles on the chart. So I declare it as a variable length array. My naming convention, because these are global variables, they're outside any of the functions, I begin global variables with a capital and my buffers are always called buffer and something. So I have 4 buffers: upper, high, low, and lower. And now the first of the functions, OnInit. This is called by the terminal when the indicator first loads, or any time that something happens that effectively changes what the indicator is going to display, such as changing the inputs, changing the symbol shown on the chart, changing the time frame on the chart. All of those things will trigger the code to come back through this OnInit, which effectively restarts the indicator. And so this is where you put all of the setup code. And the first thing I need to do in the setup code is to associate these buffers with one of these 4 indicator buffer designations. So I'm setting up the first one, which is the yellow solid line called upper, and I'm going to attach that to this buffer upper. And I do that with the statement setIndexBuffer. So it's setting the buffer upper, to buffer number 0. Now, inside the setIndexBuffer statement, buffers are numbered beginning with 0. When setting these property values, the first buffer is number 1. So there's an offset of 1 in all of these setIndexBuffer statements. But buffer number 0 is attached to the array called buffer upper, and it holds indicator data, so data that I'm going to display on the chart. I just need to repeat that now for the other 3. So all setIndexBuffer, the buffer numbers incremented by 1, and always offset by 1 from the buffer numbers here. Upper, high, low, and lower, and they're all indicator data. And that's everything that I need to do in the OnInit function to set up this indicator. At the end of that, I return init succeeded. Any other value being returned is some kind of error, and it's going to terminate the indicator. Now, there's nothing that can really go wrong inside here, but if you added some kind of validation, for example, on the inputs, you may want to fail in this statement. And so at any point, you can return a value that's not init succeeded and have the indicator fail at that point. And then the onCalculate function. It comes with a whole series of arguments. We are only going to be needing rates total and prev calculated for this particular indicator. The first statement I'm putting in here, if is stopped is a system function that is telling you that the terminal is stopping. I'm testing that at the beginning of the onCalculate function here. This particular indicator is very quick. There isn't much calculation, so it will terminate this onCalculate very quickly anyway. But in a more complicated indicator, that might take a few seconds. Once is stopped has been raised, you get basically 3 seconds before the terminal will just shut down unexpectedly. So it's a good idea to test this and stop at any convenient point. So I'm simply saying if is stopped, return 0. And I have to return a value because this is an integer function. But once that returns, it may come back in again in several onCalculate calls while the terminal is busy shutting down, but I'll simply exit at each point. My next test here, if rates total is less than INP period. Rates total is the number of candles available, not just the ones you can see on the screen, but everything further off to the left. So it's the total number of candles that are available. If that rates total is less than the INP period, which is the number of bars that I want to look at to get the high and low, then I'm again just returning 0. I could simply let the code carry on. It wouldn't really hurt, but there doesn't seem to be much point to me in doing any work if I don't even have as many candles as the period that I'm looking at. And unless you set a ridiculously high number for this INP period, that's unlikely to ever happen, but I like to cater for these cases. Now, I've mentioned that rates total tells me how many total candles there are available. Prev calculated tells me how many I have already looked at the last time this function was called. So obviously the first time it's called, that prev calculated is going to be 0. The next time it will tell me how many I've been through already. And I can use that so that I don't keep recalculating all of the candles back to the beginning of time. I only have to recalculate or calculate the candles that I'm concerned about. So I'm going to set up a variable that simply tells me how many candles I need to process. So I'm declaring a variable called count. It's an integer type. I have this statement if prev calculated is greater than rates total. So I'm saying if I've previously calculated more values than there actually are candles, or prev calculated is less than 0. Neither of those should ever happen. There's an option to, or you can set the value for the number of candles that are on the chart. If you reduce that while this is running, then it's possible that rates total will come back with a smaller number than it had last time, and so prev calculated may be greater than rates total. I actually think that's handled already internally, but it doesn't hurt to have this here. If either of those conditions happen, then I really can't process. I just set count equal to rates total. So that means I'm not going to look for a difference between prev calculated and rates total. I'm just going to calculate everything that I have. If that's not true, then count is simply the difference between rates total and prev calculated. So if I've got 1,000 candles and I previously calculated 999, then I have to calculate one candle only. And now for this number of candles that I have to loop through each one of those. So my for statement begins with an initialization. I'm initializing an internal variable I, it's a type integer, and that's equal to count minus 1. So if I have one candle only to process, I will be initialized to 0. And that's because I matches the candle numbers. Candle numbers begin at 0. So if the only candle that I have to process is the last candle, I begins at 0. The loop will continue while this condition is true, while I is greater than or equal to 0, and not is stopped. So I'm testing that again in here. I'll say again, this particular indicator would be very fast, but if you have something slower, this means that as soon as that is stop gets raised, I will terminate this loop. And here, at the end of each iteration of the loop, I minus minus, that reduces I by 1, so I minus 1, which will then carry on until I get to this point where I has gone below 0, and then we'll terminate the loop. So now, I'll take the calculation of the upper line step by step, just for the example here. I want to find the high bar inside that range. There's a function called iHighest, takes an argument of symbol, and symbol bracket bracket is the chart symbol, period bracket bracket is the chart time frame. Mode high says that I'm looking at the high prices because I can look for the highest of the close or the open or any other price, but I'm looking at the highest of the high prices. I'm looking at a range of bars or range of candles of I and P period beginning with candle number I. So if in this loop I'm at candle number 20 and I'm counting down, so candle number 20 is the 20th candle from the right of the chart. So beginning at candle number 20, if my input period is 10, then I'll be looking for the highest candle from candles 20 to 29. This I highest returns the candle number. So if the 25th candle is the highest, it will actually return 25. It doesn't return a number relative to this starting point. So that gives me bar number 25, for example, and that's just the bar, but I actually want the high price. And to get that, there's another function called iHigh. This actually returns the high price for the symbol, time frame, and bar number high bar. So I calculated the highest bar. Now I'm getting the price from that bar, or the high price from that bar. And then what I want to do is assign that to the upper buffer. And remember, buffer upper is an array, and the array is being resized to match the size of the chart. So I simply address element number I, which matches candle number I, and I put the value high price into that buffer. Now, I'm going to compress all of this into a single statement. So rather than calculate high bar and then high price and then put that into buffer upper, I'm just going to combine all of this. So in a single line, buffer upper equals the I high, symbol period, I highest, symbol period, mode high, period, I. And now I can duplicate that for the lower buffer, but in this case, I'm using I low to get the low price. I'm using I lowest to find the candle with the lowest price. Mode low because I'm looking at the low prices. Period and I are the same. To draw the two inner lines, I need to know the distance between the upper and the lower so that I can calculate percentages of that difference. So another internal variable, double delta, and that's just buffer upper minus buffer lower. And then I can put in the value for the buffer low I, which is just the lower buffer value plus that delta multiplied by the lower percent divided by 100. For buffer high, very similar, but here I'm beginning from the buffer upper and I'm subtracting delta multiplied by the upper percent. And that's all I need to calculate the values in these four buffers. and simply putting those values into these arrays, because I've associated each of those arrays with the buffers in the indicator, that draws the lines automatically for me. So that's all I need to do. The last statement here, return rates total. Now that is put in by the template, and typically in all the examples you'll see after this line I would have said if prev calculated is greater than 0, then count plus plus. That's simply saying I've already been through this loop once, because at the first time prev calculated is 0. Any time after that it will have some other number. If prev calculated is greater than 0, then I'm just adding 1 to the count. Now think about a situation where I've already calculated all the candles, no new candle has formed, and we come back into OnCalculate because there's been a new price. In that case, rates total and prev calculated would have been the same, because this prev calculated is the value that was returned by this function the last time it was called. So say I have 1,000 candles, rates total is 1,000. I've already processed everything. Prev calculated is also 1,000. I would get count equal to 0, but that won't work for me because the price has changed on that final candle. I need to make sure I always recalculate that last candle. Also, at the point where this ticks over to the next candle, I need to recalculate the candle that's just closed one more time to catch any final price change that happened in that candle. Most examples you'll see would then have a line here saying something like this: if prev calculated greater than 0, count plus plus. Nothing wrong with doing that. I've done it in almost every indicator I've ever written, but I'm going to just show a different technique here, and that is simply to say I'm going to return rates total minus 1. So the next time I come in here, I've still got 1,000 rates total, 1,000 candles on the chart. I've calculated 1,000, but I've returned 999 here, which means that this will be 1 less, or 1 more. And that should be everything. Let me just compile it to make sure. No errors. So now we can go back to MetaTrader and see the indicator on the chart. So here in the terminal, if I expand indicators, there's my Orchard folder that I created for the indicators, and here is the triple channel D. Drag that onto the chart. Let's begin with about. This is the name of the indicator, the version number, the copyright statement that you saw inside the code, and if I hover over that you can see it's a hyperlink, and that comes from the link property, and then here are the 2 description lines that we added. The colors for the 4 indicator lines, these are the colors that I assigned inside the properties. I set them all to a width of 1. I set the inner 2 to dotted lines and the outer 2 to straight lines. You can change these here in the colors panel. And then the inputs, you can see that these prompts are the comments at the end of the input lines. So I've got an input period of 10 and the upper band and the lower band percent of 30. Now I've set these to 30. You may want to make them 33 each, so it's a nice even spacing, or you may want to use Fibonacci numbers to try to get a better use of the price movement. And that will become relevant, I suppose, when we get to writing the expert advisor that uses these. But for now, I'm just going to leave those as they are. Click OK. And when I said this was a relatively fast indicator, you can see that as soon as I clicked OK, all the lines were drawn. And this hasn't just drawn the lines that you can see here on the chart. It's drawn every line back as far as I have prices. So it has calculated everything back to the beginning of all of the candles that I have available on this chart. If I bring up the indicators, I'll change the lower band to 10% and the upper band to 50, just so that you can see them move. So now the lower band is 10% above the bottom, and the upper band is halfway between the two. So that's all I have for this. This was, as I said, the MetaTrader 4 version. I'm going to follow up now with some expert advisors that use these indicators to trade. There will be at least 1, maybe 2, possibly 3 different expert advisors using this one simple indicator. As I said up at the beginning, It's a basic indicator, and you can embellish this and add your own features, additional calculations, whatever you want to that. So you can enhance the indicator. When we get to the expert advisor, you can use your enhanced indicator, or you can enhance the expert advisor itself. These are about building blocks for you to create your own strategy. If this has been useful, then please click the like button. It helps me to get views, and that helps to pay for the channel. And if you want to see more videos, then click subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when the videos are released. Thank you for watching.